Tonight, we begin with something a little less mathematical, but arguably much more useful, especially if you ever find yourself without electricity, running water, or a working knowledge of how toilets used to function. We're talking about medieval survival techniques. In the medieval world, fire wasn't just handy. It was everything. It gave you heat. It cooked your food. It lit your surroundings. And it could be your only companion during a week-long storm in a thatched hut. Fire meant the difference between soup and raw roots, between comfort and frostbite. So when you traveled, you didn't pack snacks. You packed fire. This is where the portable fire bundle enters the story. Think of it as the medieval version of a Zippo lighter, if that lighter was slow, smelled like sheep, and had the potential to incinerate your belongings if you were careless. Here is how it worked. You start with a glowing ember from your home hearth, typically charcoal, and wrap it in dried moss, fungal matter, or a spongy wood called punk. The whole glowing core was then stuffed into a hollowed horn or a leather pouch made to withstand high temperatures. Some variations wrapped the ember in linen, soaked in saltpeter, or smeared with animal fat to extend the smoldering time. Properly prepared, the ember could smolder for hours, sometimes even a full day. It just needed a little breath and a bit of gentle coaxing to reignite. Like your sense of self-worth after a tax audit from the local baron. This bundle was compact, reusable, and essential. It saved you from the deeply unpleasant process of striking sparks with flint and steel for half an hour while trying to look like you knew what you were doing. Starting a fire from scratch was hard. If your tinder was damp or your fingers were frozen into sad little claws, it could be near impossible. With a fire bundle, you could walk into a clearing, gather a few sticks, unwrap your little mossy miracle, and with some encouragement, and maybe a prayer to Saint Smokey of the Ember, summon a flame. Suddenly, you had warmth, light, soup, and the possibility of casting dramatic shadow puppets against the trees. Essential life stuff. It was also a matter of neighborly courtesy. Passing a fire bundle to a fellow traveler heading to market wasn't just generous, it was practical. No one wanted to be the person who forgot their ember and had to beg strangers for fire at dusk. That kind of thing got you judged, and not quietly. Should have packed your moss, Gerald, was the medieval equivalent of public shame. Now, let's talk about meat. Preserving it, to be exact. Today, a prepper pantry looks like a monument to freeze-dried ambition jerky. Vacuum-sealed beans, mystery cans from the pre-internet era. But in the Middle Ages, meat preservation was an art rooted in fear. The fear of running out of food in the dead of winter, with nothing left but turnips and existential dread. Smoking meat wasn't about flavor, it was about survival. And it wasn't the romantic, applewood-scented grill smoke we dream of today. It was practical, gritty, and often smelled like pine and despair. People with open hearths didn't hang their meat proudly above the flames like in a fantasy film. They hid it behind the fire, high up in the rafters. Why? Because that's where the cool smoke went rising gently through the house, out of reach of animals, children, and the neighbor who always happened to show up at dinner time. This smoke wasn't just hot air. Over days, weeks, even months, it slowly dried the meat, killing bacteria, repelling insects, and turning your precious pork into something that could survive into the next season. After a while, it didn't look like food anymore. It looked like a meat fossil, but it worked. This process created meat that was dark, hardened, and ready to withstand decay, bugs, and surprise visits from extended family. And because it was hidden, it was harder to steal. That mattered in communities where I didn't see your sausage hanging there, could be used as an actual legal defense. And there was a bonus benefit. As the meat cured in the rafters, the smoke filled the house, warming it and discouraging pests. Nothing says cozy winter evening like sitting under a suspended ham in a smoke-drenched room, wondering if your dinner might fall on you. Now let's jump to medieval home security. Today, we've got motion sensors, tripwires, camera drones, and that one guy who insists his dog can sniff out intruders from a mile away. But medieval folks had no batteries, no marking, and no Wi-Fi. Their solution? Living fences. And yes, they were exactly what they sound like. Imagine needing to keep cows in, kids out, and neighbors honest, all without lumber, nails, or shouting. The solution was to grow your walls. These living fences, or hedgerows, were made by planting fast-growing, flexible trees like willow, hawthorn, hazel, or blackthorn close together. As they grew, people bent and wove the branches into a dense interlocking barrier that could stop livestock, redirect geese, and absolutely ruin a thief's evening. Some hedges were laid, meaning the trunks were partially cut and bent sideways to encourage sideways growth while staying alive. Others included thorny plants for extra pain and free berries, assuming you had the hands of a masochist. These fences didn't wear out. They got better. Every year, they grew thicker, stronger, and more impenetrable. Unlike wooden fences that decayed and needed repairs, hedgerows became living fortresses, homes for birds, havens for pollinators, and defenders of soil against erosion. And some of them are still here. In parts of England, hedgerows over 700 years old are still standing. That means they've outlived kings, empires, plagues, and several political experiments. Try getting that kind of mileage from a modern fence. With its porous surface, clay cooled what it held inside. Essentially, a medieval refrigerator, just quieter, cheaper, and much less likely to make your stew taste like chemicals. People buried these pots in shaded pits or root cellars, taking advantage of the Earth's stable underground temperature to preserve food, drink, and occasionally a secret pie. In colder seasons, the same pots could be heated by a fire and then slowly radiate warmth through the night. Clay bricks were tucked into beds, slipped under cloaks, or wrapped in wool and packed into wagons, an earthy version of a hot water bottle. Unlike modern batteries, these never exploded. The worst they'd do was crack and surrender silently. If you've ever cursed at a pan for becoming one with your eggs, you've likely thanked modern non-stick coatings. But in the Middle Ages centuries, before Teflon or televised kitchen miracles, people relied on something far more primal: friction glaze. Yes, they hand-polished their cooking pots. It was the non-stick solution of a time when most meals involved boiling cabbage and hoping for the best. The process was painstaking. Most medieval cookware was made from coarse clay, which naturally stuck to food like a bad decision. To reduce this, potters rubbed the still damp pots with smooth stones, animal bones, or hardwood tools. This compressed the surface, sealed the pores, and created a subtle sheen known as burnishing. It wasn't magic. It didn't stop stew from burning. But it did make food stick a little less and cleanup slightly easier. Some went further, rubbing animal fat into the polished pots before firing them, a sort of medieval seasoning that helped resist water, reduce cracking, and extend the life of the vessel. Burnished pots even looked better. In a world where most things were wooden, rough, or decaying, a shiny cooking pot was a humble form of household prestige. Labor-intensive? Absolutely. Probably responsible for more than a few aching shoulders. But it was worth it if your porridge didn't fossilize. Today's survivalists might spend small fortunes on titanium skillets and miracle coatings. Medieval folks sat down, grabbed a rock, and rubbed the pot until it listened. Navigation was another art, especially in the dense fog, deep forests, or on mornings when the mist turned the road into a blur. Before GPS, before Google Maps, before that one friend who insists on just feeling the way, people used their ears. Sound became a guide when vision failed. This wasn't echolocation in the sci-fi sense. It was simple, practical listening. Villages rang bells not just for church services, but to cut through weather and remind travelers which direction civilization lived. A distant bell meant you weren't completely lost. Cattle and sheep wore bells too, not only to prevent wandering into oblivion, but so that herders could track them or find their way back by the sound of the herd. Of course, that system wasn't foolproof. More than one traveler followed the wrong jingle and ended up staring at Gerald's livestock again. Some paths had hanging pots, clappers, or crude wind chimes tied to trees. Their clattering in the breeze became directional cues, a faint metallic reassurance that you were still on some kind of trail. Fishermen used horns and gauged how sound bounced back to locate the harbor. Others clapped or shouted, counting the seconds between the sound and its echo, measuring distance the way you might gauge a storm by thunder. Even taverns played their part. Laughter, music, and gossip spilled into the streets like acoustic breadcrumbs. If you were lost and hungry, following the sound of a lute or the slurred argument of two drunks was a legitimate tactic. Warmth, ale, and someone passed out near the hearth were often not far behind. Tooth care was another matter entirely. If you want to avoid losing your teeth by your mid-30s, you had one main tool: charcoal. Not toothpaste, not mint. Just burned wood, crushed into powder and rubbed onto your teeth by hand, with a stick or in some fashion-forward cases tied to a rag. Mixed with salt, herbs, or crushed shells, this ash became the medieval answer to dental hygiene. Was it pleasant? Not remotely. Rubbing gritty carbon against your molars felt about as enjoyable as chewing sand during a campfire. But it worked, sort of. Charcoal had mild antibacterial effects. It could remove buildup and delay the total collapse of your dental infrastructure, at least until someone named Bartholomew had to yank out the offending tooth with pliers and prayer. Breath, too, was addressed. Fresh, in medieval terms, meant not immediately eye-watering. Some added sage or mint for flavor, or rinsed with vinegar for good measure, though the vinegar likely undid most of the charcoal's work. Still, it beat the alternative, which was letting plaque take control until your gums staged a full-scale rebellion. Charcoal has made a comeback today, of course. You'll find it in spa treatments, hipster toothpaste, even lemonades. But back then, it wasn't a trend. It was necessity. You didn't want to end up at the mercy of the local blacksmith's cousin, who also did tooth removals on weekends. And finally, housing held together with sticks, mud, straw, and the stubborn refusal to freeze. Most peasant homes were built using a method called wattle and daub. It sounds charming. It was survival. Wattle was the internal framework long, bendy branches woven between upright wooden posts, kind of like basket weaving, but scaled up and holding up your walls. This created a lattice that, while flimsy on its own, was quickly coated in daub, a thick, sticky paste made of clay, straw, animal hair, and sometimes dung. Applied by hand, the daub filled gaps, dried hard, and became a rudimentary but effective wall. These structures were insulating, repairable, and surprisingly long-lasting. If a wall cracked, you didn't rebuild it. You grabbed a handful of mud and patched it. Thatched roofs, made from tightly bundled reeds or straw, kept out rain and helped trap heat. Floors were often packed earth. Windows were rare, and when they existed, they were small and covered with oiled cloth or slivers of horn. Glass was a luxury. Most light came from fire, and most warmth came from layers of fabric, mud, or livestock. These homes didn't offer much privacy. They smelled earthy at best, but they worked. For families, for livestock, for generations. A structure built from what was available held together by technique, community, and a decent amount of mud. Next came the Daba-charming hand-mixed concoction of mud, straw, clay, and animal dung. Yes, dung. Because in the Middle Ages, if your construction materials weren't at least partially made of poop, were you even trying? This rich, earthy paste was smeared into the woven wattle frame and left to dry, forming what turned out to be a surprisingly durable and insulated wall. It kept out wind, held in heat, and added that special rustic aroma that whispered, "Home sweet slightly composting home." No, it wasn't glamorous. These walls cracked. They flaked. Occasionally, they drew the curious attention of livestock. Patching them was part of your regular to-do list, right between "don't starve" and "yell at the neighbor's goat." But they were cheap, effective, and best of all, completely local. No shipping, no packaging, just dirt, effort, and maybe a little emotional damage. Despite how primitive it sounds, wattle and daub could last. Decades, even centuries with proper care. In fact, some medieval homes still standing today have their original daub walls, meaning some random peasant with a bucket of mud and a dream built something more durable than your last contractor. Now picture medieval bedtime. A lumpy straw mattress stuffed with regret, a sagging thatched roof, tripping something you'd rather not identify, and the ever-present threat of fleas, lice, and buzzing things that crawled with alarming confidence. But here's the surprisingly elegant part herb-laced bedding. A rough blend of aromatherapy and pest control born not from luxury, but from pure, scratchy necessity. Medieval people didn't want to wake up as a feast for parasites. See, stuffing your bed with plain straw was just asking for unwanted guests. So clever households started mixing in strong scented herbs, lavender, mint, wormwood, pennyroyal, rosemary. Not to impress guests, to repel invaders. These herbs were the natural bug spray of their time. Their powerful smells kept fleas, lice, and mosquitoes at bay, and occasionally, maybe an overly affectionate spouse. Some even believed herbs like tansy or rue could keep away demons. Conveniently, they also discouraged nosy in-laws. A bed that smelled like an aggressive salad might have been off-putting, but it was better than waking up with bite marks in places you couldn't scratch publicly. And this wasn't just a one-time fix. You had to refresh the herbs every few days, or risk becoming the midnight buffet for a tick with an attitude problem. The war on pests didn't stop at mattresses either. Herbs were scattered across floors, woven into door frames, and hung in bundles over beds. Basically, if there was a surface, someone shoved a sprig of wormwood into it. It turned houses into slightly chaotic herbal apothecaries, but the result was a home that smelled better, felt cleaner, and had far fewer bitey residents than the goat barn next door. Before bug spray, netting, or modern cleaning products, this was genius. Entire manuals were written on which herbs worked best. Some believed lavender even made your dreams sweeter. The science might be shaky, but if it distracted you from the soggy ceiling or the fact your pillow was literally a sack of oats, it was a win. Now let's talk refrigeration, or the lack of it. Long before the age of softly humming fridge units and glowing freezer drawers packed with mystery leftovers, medieval folks had to improvise. They needed to keep food from turning into a biohazard. Their solution? Passive preservation using stone. Enter the cooling slab. Known by various names, slab shells, stone larders, or more casually, that cold rock we put the cheese on. It was simple, effective, and required no power-only patience and some geological understanding. Here's how it worked. Large slabs of stone, usually slate or marble if you were well off, were built directly into the shaded side of a home, typically the north-facing wall. These slabs absorbed the coolness of the surrounding air and the earth itself, creating a pocket of lower temperature. A natural, silent, spider-friendly mini-fridge. During cooler months, this setup helped preserve milk, butter, meat, and anything else you didn't want rotting before dinner. Even in the warmer seasons, the slab stayed cooler than the ambient air. That's thanks to something called thermal mass. Basically, stone doesn't care how hot it is outside. It just keeps being cold, like a grumpy aunt at a family reunion. No electricity, no cords, no buzzing. Just a big rock and a well-placed shelf. It wasn't perfect. It didn't keep things frozen, but it slowed spoilage dramatically. In some households, these stone shelves were combined with ventilation holes designed to funnel in cool air from shaded exterior vents, improving circulation and maintaining a consistently lower temperature. And all of this was done without blueprints, user manuals, or repair technicians. Just stone, airflow, and trial by rot. It was passive design at its finest. In wealthier homes, full pantry rooms were built with stone walls and clay floors for maximum cooling effect. In others, the humble slab in the kitchen wall did the job. You didn't stock up for weeks. You preserved what you could, stretched it as long as possible, and hoped your neighbor's goat didn't get to it first. Just stone, shade, and sheer hope. That was the refrigeration strategy. In some homes, they took it a step further, building entire cold rooms or stone-lined pantries with thick walls and earthy floors. These were the precursors to modern root cellars. Positioned deliberately far from the hearth, their location mattered. Medieval folks loved a hot stew as much as the next peasant, but they didn't want their butter turning into soup while they stirred it. In wealthier households, these cool rooms had extras damp cloths draped over shelves, porous jars filled with evaporating water. All subtle, but clever ways to amplify the cooling effect using nothing but physics. Evaporative cooling, without anyone having to use the word evaporative. No jargon, just instinct and trial and error genius. In poorer homes, the approach was more hopeful. Set the milk on a cold rock. Pray it lasts until lunch. And if it didn't, well, sour milk wasn't always a disaster. Sometimes it just became cheese. Now let's talk injuries. Today, you twist an ankle or get stung by a bee and reach for an ice pack. Some gel that promises cooling relief and delivers disappointment, or maybe even a painkiller. But in the Middle Ages, medicine was often a choice between leeches, praying, or being really lucky. Fortunately, there was another option, something accessible, surprisingly effective, slightly leafy. Cabbage. Yes, cabbage. That humble, slightly tragic vegetable best known today for haunting school lunches and making kitchens smell like regret, once played a noble role in medieval medicine. Cabbage leaves were the go-to compress for swelling, bruises, joint pain, mastitis, and whatever vaguely plague-adjacent rash you didn't want to talk about. It wasn't complicated. Cabbage is naturally cool, pliable, and mildly antimicrobial. It's like nature looked at inflammation and said, "Here, have a vegetable." You'd take a large leaf, preferably cold, crush it lightly to release its juices, and wrap it around the afflicted area. Tie it on with linen, string, or the medieval equivalent of good intentions. And the result? Surprisingly soothing. The leaf's moisture helped reduce swelling, its natural compounds like sulfur, and flavonoids fought off minor infections, and the faint farm smell kept your relatives at a respectable distance. Some healers even warmed the leaves instead. For chest congestion or sore joints, a heated cabbage poultice was a low-tech version of vapor rubber theer, leafier and blessedly less minty. Most importantly, it didn't involve cutting, bleeding, or summoning a monk with ominous tools. It was simple, repeatable, and relatively trauma-free. Just you, a cabbage, and the hope it worked. And yes, in tougher times, those same leaves might end up in your soup pot once they finish their shift on your shin. No waste, maximum resilience. Iron stomachs required. Now imagine a night before electricity, batteries, or even halfway decent candles. Your fire is out. Your home is dark. Your options limited. Candles were expensive. Torches were impractical indoors. And unless you were wealthy or a church, light was a luxury. Enter the rushlight, also known affectionately and accurately as the bacon torch. Rushlights were born of necessity. You'd take a long, thin stalk of rush those marsh-loving plants found where your boots sank, and dry them out. Then you'd peel them, soak them in animal fat, and leave them to harden. The result, a semi-flammable reed that burned slowly and unevenly. You'd clip it into a holder, light the end, and bask in the faint glow of what was essentially a pork-scented candle. Rush lights weren't elegant. They sputtered, they smoked, and they filled your home with the unmistakable scent of fried meat and bog water. But they worked. And in the Middle Ages, that was the only standard that mattered. Each rush light burned for 10 to 30 minutes, depending on the size and fat saturation. Need more light? Light another. Want a timer? Count the burns. Boil it for half a rush light was a totally valid measurement. Wait for 2 rush lights before checking the bread. Or even, if Gerald's not back from the alehouse before the rush burns out, he's sleeping outside. They were cheap, easy to make, and surprisingly sustainable, assuming you didn't mind living in a house that always smelled faintly like breakfast. And finally, let's return to dairy. Because storing butter in a hot, bug-filled cottage wasn't exactly easy. There were no fridges, no coolers, and definitely no insulated tubs. So medieval ingenuity turned, once again, to nature, specifically to swamps. Someone somewhere looked at a marsh and thought, let's put the butter in there. And strangely enough, it worked. In areas with abundant wetlands, people discovered that submerging sealed butter containers in cool, stagnant water helped preserve it far longer than leaving it on a shelf. The water's consistent temperature and the insulating mud acted as a kind of natural fridge. Butter could be packed into clay pots or wooden containers, sealed with animal fat or wax, and sunk into the mud out of reach of sunlight, heat, and curious dogs. Yes, the butter might emerge smelling faintly of pond, but it was edible. It hadn't spoiled. And that, in medieval terms, was a culinary miracle. This kind of swamp storage wasn't exclusive to butter. It extended to other perishables, too. Anything that needed to be kept cool might end up buried, submerged, or hidden in an earthy nook. Refrigeration didn't exist, but cool, dark, wet places, those were everywhere. And medieval folks used them with the kind of practicality that comes from having very few options and a deep fear of food poisoning. And thus, bog butter was born. Bog butter is exactly what it sounds like. Butter, or sometimes lard, that someone deliberately buried in a peat bog. Why a bog, you ask? Because despite being full of mud, buzzing insects, and mysterious creatures that probably hiss when disturbed, peat bogs are cold, low in oxygen, and acidic. Nature's least hospitable but surprisingly effective preservation chamber. People would take large quantities of butter, wrap them in cloth, bark, or even seal them in wooden barrels, and bury them deep into the peat. Not for a few hours, not even a few weeks. We're talking months, years, sometimes centuries. In Ireland, archaeologists have unearthed bog butter over 3,000 years old. That's right. Some ancient Celtic farmer's emergency snack is now sitting in a glass case instead of melting on someone's toast. How did it survive? The cold, airless bog kept bacteria and fungi from thriving. The tannins in the peat slowed down oxidation. Together, they created the kind of environment that's unpleasant for nearly everything except butter. The result? A preserved lump of dairy that, according to the few brave souls who've tasted it, smells like cheese, smoke, and ancient regret. The result? Flat, chewy loaves that looked like bread and tasted unmistakably like forest floor. Still, when your options were bark bread or slowly becoming bark yourself, carbs won every time. Some people even toasted or roasted the bark before grinding it. That added a smoky flavor, or at least masked the fact that you were eating a tree. And this wasn't just a peasant trick. During sieges, or especially harsh winters, entire towns turned to bark-based survival rations. In some areas, harvesting cambium from communal forests was regulated and even taxed. Too much bark removal, and the tree would die. Not enough, and so would the villagers. Balance was everything. So if the world ever ends, and you find yourself standing hungry in a forest, no grocery stores in sight, don't panic. Look for a birch tree. Channel your inner medieval survivor. Because yes, you can absolutely eat that. Was this your everyday cooking butter? Absolutely not. This was long-term storage. Survival stockpile. A greasy insurance policy. It might have been used for winter rations, as tribute to a local lord, or for feeding that one cousin who always appeared in spring, just passing through, and somehow never brought his own food. And bog storage came with a hidden benefit: security. If you wanted to keep your butter safe from thieves, raiders, or nosy neighbors, burying it in a freezing, ankle-deep mud pit was a solid plan. No one's digging through icy swamp muck at dawn to steal your breakfast. And if you repicturing medieval folks storing food in neat hobbit holes with charming jars and tidy shelves, let's readjust that image. Medieval food storage was not aesthetic. It was survival. Less Pinterest, more, please let this not rot before winter finishes the job. One of their more ingenious methods, hollow trees. Yes, the original self-growing pantry, zero carpentry, built-in camouflage. A hollow tree was nature's free storage unit. These cavities form naturally by age, lightning, rot, or overly ambitious squirrels were scattered across the medieval landscape, and people used them for everything from hiding cheese to concealing weapons. Need to stash a hunk of smoked meat or a few apples somewhere cool and out of reach? Shove it in a tree. Want to keep food from being eaten by goats, bears, or Gerald? Tree. Traveling through a forest and just bagged a slightly suspicious pheasant? Tree. No one questioned the tree. Inside, the bark insulated, the cavity protected. It wasn't long-term refrigeration, but it was shade, it was concealed, and it was cool, especially in colder months. Some folks lined the inside with moss, bark, or dry leaves for extra dryness and a faint sense of sanitation. Others placed food into ceramic pots or leather containers before storing them, which helped reduce the risk of woodland creatures licking dinner. And it wasn't just food. Hollow trees held valuables, herbs, and sometimes even weapons. In desperate times, during raids or sudden attacks, they were even used to hide small children. Not for babysitting, for survival. A good hollow tree could mean the difference between starving and making it through the season. Or at the very least, the difference between cheese that's cool and cheese that smells like foot. And then there's bark bread. In the survival world, eating bark usually signals that something has gone horribly wrong. But in the Middle Ages, it was a legitimate food, not a gourmet choice, but a fallback. Introducing bark bread, a rustic delicacy that basically says, I didn't starve, but I did chew a pine tree. It wasn't made entirely of bark, thankfully. The inner layer, called cambium, was scraped from trees like pine, birch, or elm. This soft inner lining, when dried and ground, could be mixed with flour or meal to stretch out limited supplies. In times of famine, this was more than filler. It was food, kind of. Bark bread was dense, dark, and slightly bitter, with the texture of wet cardboard and the personality of a tree stump. But it provided calories and helped people survive another day, which in medieval terms made it a success. It wasn't only for the starving. In some cultures, it became traditional during lean seasons. You might toast it over a fire, add wild herbs, maybe even smear it with whatever dairy hadn't spoiled or turned into swamp butter. Some versions were baked flat like a cracker. Others resembled dense loaves. None were winning bake-off prizes. The important thing is that bark bread kept people alive. It turned what should have been inedible into something barely edible. And it proved again how medieval people looked around at their environment and said, how can we turn this into food? During times of famine, which, to be clear, happened often, Peasants didn't turn to the forest for mushrooms or wild game. Too seasonal, too dangerous, too many unknowns with a high probability of poisoning. Instead, they turned to the trees, specifically to the bark, but not the rough outer stuff. They were after the cambium, the soft, moist layer just beneath the bark of trees like pine, birch, or elm. This layer could be carefully shaved off, dried, ground into a coarse flour, and mixed into bread dough. Was it delicious? Absolutely not. Was it nutritious? Shockingly, yes. Bark contains fiber, trace minerals, and complex carbohydrates. It wasn't gourmet, but it kept people alive when the grain bins were empty, taxes were due, and the cows had stopped giving milk, probably organizing a protest. Bark flour was rarely used alone. It was usually blended with whatever else was on hand. Acorns, nettles, wild herbs, and if you were lucky, actual flour. In the land between the Tigris and Euphrates, beauty wasn't casual, it was ritual. In ancient Mesopotamia, grooming wasn't just about appearance, it was devotion. Cleanliness and adornment were tied to social status, divine favor, and even political standing. You weren't just preparing for the day, you were preparing for the gods. Let's start with the eyes. Cleopatra didn't invent dramatic eyeliner. Sumerians were doing it centuries earlier. Both men and women painted bold black lines around their eyes, using a mix of coal and powdered minerals like lead, copper, and antimony. Dangerous? Probably. But they believed it protected against evil spirits and also served as sunblock in the glaring desert light. Their skincare would give today's beauty influencers pause. Crushed semi-precious stones were blended into perfumed oils for exfoliation and brightness. Mud from mineral-rich riverbanks was slathered onto the body in thick layers, then scraped off after drying to reveal polished skin. This was the original clay maskless spa day, more ancient chemistry. Hair removal was another priority. Using sharpened seashells or primitive tweezers, they scraped or plucked body hair away. Smooth skin symbolized not just refinement, but godliness. Even statues of their deities were hairless, flawless, and adorned with painted symmetrical features and wide, lined eyes. And the scent? Not just for pleasure fragrance was power. Myrrh, frankincense, cedar, these weren't just pleasing aromas. They were spiritual tools. Infused into animal fats, they were applied like perfumes and believed to purify the body, attract divine favor, and elevate one's status. In royal circles, perfumed oils were valuable enough to be offered as tribute. Even permanent cosmetics existed. Eyebrow tattoos, created with soot or plant-based dyes, were common among temple women. A bold brow wasn't just a trend, it was a symbol. Beauty wasn't fleeting, it was etched into the skin. Now, if you think that's intense, let's talk Cleopatra. More than a queen, she was the ambassador of Greco-Roman beauty obsession. Her face adorned coins, but her rituals shaped empires. Roman women inherited Egypt's love for luxury, and a hiss amplified it. Take the milk bath. Cleopatra was rumored to bathe in donkey milk daily. Whether it was a fact or a myth, the practice caught on. Sour milk contains lactic acid, a natural exfoliant. Roman women embraced this, combining milk with honey and rose petals for full-body treatments. The goal? Smooth, pale, wrinkle-free skin. Effective? Yes. Affordable? Not unless you had a stable full of donkeys. The Roman ideal of beauty centered on ghostly pale skin, a sign of nobility and privilege. To achieve this, women applied cerussa, a face powder made of white lead. It gave them the desired matte finish, but with horrifying side effects: sores, hair loss, and in extreme cases, death. But the logic was simple. Better to look like a goddess than live too long. Rouge and lip stains were made from red ochre, crushed insects, or mulberry juice. Eyeliner and eyebrow color came from soot mixed with animal fat. Bold features were in. And if your brows weren't naturally dramatic, no problem, draw them on, or better yet, tattoo them. Hair was a competitive sport. Roman women curled it with heated rods centuries before the invention of curling irons. They dyed it using herbal mixes, ash, and even fermented leeches for that coveted blonde look. Wigs made from the hair of German slaves were popular among the wealthy, signaling both power and exotic style. Perfume was another obsession. Saffron, cinnamon, and rose oil were infused into creams, oils, and ointments, rubbed into every possible surface of the body. Bathhouses were less hygiene centers and more botanical sanctuaries soaked in scent. Meanwhile, in ancient China, beauty took a different path, one rooted in philosophy. Where Rome chased glamour, Chinese aesthetics prized harmony, balance, and inner key. Their standards were no less rigorous. A pale, porcelain-like complexion was considered the height of refinement, not because of sun fear, but because fair skin signaled nobility and leisure. White lead, pearl powder, and powdered rice were all common ingredients in face makeup. And unlike other cultures, Chinese formulations often had medical origins, designed by court physicians to boost longevity and inner balance, not just looks. Jade was the gem of choice. Jade rollers, repopularized today by social media, were already in use centuries ago by women of the Han Dynasty. Cool to the touch and believed to absorb toxins, these tools were used daily to promote circulation and youthfulness. Even jade pillows were popular among emperors, thought to purify the skin during sleep. Eyebrows were an art. Women shaped and painted them not just for fashion, but to reflect mood, status, and political trends. The moth-wing brow, the willow leaf brow, each style spoke a different silent language. In certain dynasties, long swooping brows were the fashion arched, delicately to resemble wings in flight. In others, short, upward tilted strokes dominated the aesthetic. Ink made from burnt willow or charcoal was applied using fine brushes crafted from rabbit fur. Some beauty trends even encouraged removing the natural brows entirely and redrawing them higher up on the forehead, creating the illusion of a more divine, elevated, face less earthly, more celestial. Lips were tinted using a mixture of cinnabar and animal fat, sometimes combined with beeswax for texture. Rouge made from crushed safflower petals was applied to the cheeks in small, deliberate circles. Beauty marks weren't always natural. Many women painted tiny black dots near the eyes, or lip symbols of allure, flirtation, and mystique. Hair was a daily ritual. Ancient Chinese women washed and nourished their hair with fermented rice water and camellia oil. Many grew their hair long, often down to their knees, styling it into elaborate updos secured with jade pins and golden combs. These weren't just hairstyles. They were declarations of elegance, discipline, and cultural grace. Beauty, to the ancient Chinese, wasn't loud or flamboyant. It was symbolic, meditative. It was restraint paired with quiet power, written in powdered faces, perfect brows, and hair that told a silent story of refinement. But if there was ever a time when beauty literally killed, it was the Renaissance. In the royal courts of Italy, England, and France, beauty was not just art, it was a chemical gamble. Women weren't just enhancing their appearance. They were slowly poisoning themselves in pursuit of an ideal that glowed alabaster white with crimson lips and refined, arched brows. And the method? A cosmetic toolkit that would send modern dermatologists into a coma. Let's start with the most infamous, Venetian ceruse, a luxurious white face paste made of lead and vinegar. It delivered a smooth, porcelain finish that masked blemishes and age. Queen Elizabeth I used it obsessively. Under candlelight, It created a ghostly glow that embodied nobility. But the side effects? Corroded skin, tooth loss, paralysis, death. A radiant complexion purchased one application at a time with your health. Then came arsenic. For those seeking a lighter complexion or fewer freckles, arsenic wafers were sold as beauty pills. Taken regularly, they gave the skin a pale, almost translucent appearance. Right before the vomiting, kidney failure and internal bleeding began. But beauty was relentless. It didn't wait for your organs to catch up. Eyebrows were thinned dramatically or removed altogether. A high, rounded forehead was so prized that some women shaved back their hairlines to enlarge it. Balding was rebranded as noble a sign of intellect and virtue. Cheek color came from crushed berries, cochineal bugs, or vermilion. Lips were painted with similar substances. Some women used mercury-based red dyes for that intense, seductive hue along with a generous dose of irreversible nerve damage. But in a time of short lifespans, flushed cheeks weren't just attractive. They were proof of youth and vitality. And the scent? Cloying perfumes made from ambergris, musk, and civet were worn to mask the pungent reality beneath layers of toxic. Cosmetics. Bathing was still considered suspicious in many parts of Europe. Perfume was not just enhancement, it was camouflage. Hair was its own battlefield. Golden locks were the ideal, especially in Italy. Women bleached their hair with a blend of sulfur, soda, and lemon juice. Then they sat in the sun wearing wide-brimmed hats with the crown cut out, exposing only the hair. It worked, but it scorched the scalp. Beauty demanded sacrifice, one strand at a time. Meanwhile, in ancient India, beauty didn't shout. It chanted softly. Long before clean beauty became a marketing slogan, India had already written the original manual. It was Ayurveda, the science of life. Beauty wasn't just external. It was a reflection of inner harmony, spiritual balance, and elemental alignment, known as the dashas. Cleansing was sacred. Women of the Vedic period bathed in turmeric-infused water or milk. Then came exfoliation with ubtan, a paste made from chickpea flour, sandalwood, turmeric, milk, and rosewater. It brightened the skin, slowed aging, and balanced the energy of the body. Every ingredient had both cosmetic and medicinal purpose. No synthetics, no waste, just earth, purpose, and ritual. Hair was a crown, both literal and symbolic. Oils made from coconut, amla, Indian gooseberry, and hibiscus were warmed and massaged into the scalp-stimulating hair growth, calming the mind and preserving natural color. Thick, waist-length hair was a sign of vitality and womanhood. Hair oiling was a communal event, intimate, meditative, and bonding. Kyle, the black eyeliner still worn across India, had roots in both aesthetics and spirituality. Made from soot and ghee, it was believed to protect from the evil eye. Mothers applied it not just to themselves, but to their baby's eyes as a shield against negative forces. It also framed the eyes, enhancing their natural depth and intensity. Fragrance was divine. Entire cities like Kanauj became famous for distilling attar oils made from flowers like jasmine, rose, and vetiver. These perfumes were worn on the skin, rubbed into the hair, or added to bathwater. They weren't just for romance. Scents were believed to clarify the mind and align the senses with spiritual focus. Lip and cheek tints came from beetroot, saffron, and crushed rose petals. Teeth were cleaned with neem twigs and charcoal. Even oral hygiene was linked to moon phases and dashic balance, timed with care and purpose. And then there was Mendi henna, used to decorate hands and feet, especially for weddings. It wasn't just ornamental. It cooled the body, reduced stress, and marked transitions in life. Each swirl told a story of joy, fertility, and change. Finally, the Greeks. Ancient Greece revered beauty, but not for seduction. For them, physical perfection reflected inner virtue. A balanced face or well-formed body wasn't just attractive, it was proof of harmony, intelligence, and divine favor. Grooming wasn't vanity, it was civic duty. Skin tone mattered. Pale meant noble, tan meant labor. Greek women used powders made from white lead, chalk, or crushed shells to achieve that ghostly finish. The layers were so thick, some women cracked. Their makeup when they smiled. Sacrifice, again, for beauty. Lips and cheeks were flushed with mulberries, red iron oxide, or even wine sediment. But subtlety was key. Too much color hinted at impropriety. Light application meant health and modesty. Heavy makeup? That was for the Hittite courtesans, known for elaborate cosmetics and seductive charm. Hair was long, wavy, and often braided or tied in ornate buns. Held in place with ivory or bronze pins, it was styled with care and symbolism. To lighten hair, women used vinegar, lemon, and ash. It wasn't glamorous, but it got the job done. Blonde hair especially was. Idealized in ancient Greece, not just as attractive, but as divine. It carried the air of something foreign, noble, and touched by the gods. Think Helen of Troy, the face that launched 1,000 ships. Elite Greek women who weren't naturally blessed with golden locks often turned to wigs or hairpieces, some made from the hair of enslaved women from the north. A statement of status, yes, but also a borrowed identity wrapped in wealth and myth. Eyebrows were equally important, not just shaped, but styled to convey virtue. A single continuous brow, unibrow, was actually considered beautiful. It symbolized purity, intelligence, and scholarly grace. Those without the natural connection faked it. Powdered antimony or soot was used to draw a bridge between brows. Some women even glued strands of goat hair in place. It wasn't a joke. It was fashion, and it worked. Perfumes were blended with intention. Olive oil was the base, infused with herbs like marjoram, thyme, and iris root. Fragrance wasn't a finishing touch, it was essential. It was applied after bathing, which the Greeks did obsessively. Public baths weren't just for cleansing. They were civic, spiritual, and social. Cleanliness was next to godliness literally. Meanwhile, in the lush jungles and highlands of Mesoamerica, beauty wasn't soft. It was sacred, striking, and often painful. Among the Aztec and Maya civilizations, appearance was a public declaration of identity, power, and divine alignment. One of the most intense traditions, cranial modification. From infancy, wooden boards were bound to a baby's head, gently but persistently shaping the skull into a smooth, elongated slope. The result was a cone-like profile seen as noble, intelligent, and spiritually elevated. The smoother and longer the forehead, the higher one's social rank. Then there were the teeth. Maya lights embedded jade, turquoise, and hematite directly into their front teeth. Obsidian tools were used to drill tiny holes, and natural resins held the precious stones in place. The sparkle when they smiled wasn't metaphorical, it was literal, and the pain tolerated, even admired. Tooth filing was also practiced, shaping teeth into sharp points or symbolic patterns. These modifications mimicked animal traits, suggesting strength, courage, and a divine nature. In a society where transformation meant transcendence, even, your smile was sacred. Color was vital. Aztec women often painted their cheeks with red and yellow pigment. Both genders wore face paint for ceremonies, with specific meanings: red for life and fertility, black for war or devotion. Cochineal crushed insects created a deep, vibrant crimson. Each pigment was chosen with intention. Piercings and tattoos were also common. Ears, noses, and lips were adorned with jade, bone, or shell. Tattoos made with thorns and ink recorded lineage, religious roles, or battlefield valor. These markings weren't accessories. They were commitments to gods like Quetzalcoatl and Ixchel. Even crossed eyes were considered beautiful among the Maya. Mothers dangled beads in front of infants to train their eyes inward, a sign of spiritual depth, not deformity. Vision turned inward to see the divine. Across the vast and varied terrain of ancient Africa, beauty was as diverse as the land itself. From the banks of the Nile to the grasslands of Nubia and the trading empires of West Africa, beauty rituals were both practical and profound reflections of identity, spirituality, and celestial alignment. In ancient Egypt, beauty bordered on science. Men and women wore black kohl around the eyes, not only to accentuate, but to protect. Made from galena, lead sulfide, this iconic eyeliner reduced glare and repelled infection. The extended lines created the almond-shaped eyes seen in Egyptian art. These weren't just features. They were spiritual portals channels to the divine. Perfume was omnipresent. Egyptians wore wax cones on their heads during ceremonies infused with myrrh, cinnamon, and lotus oil. As they melted from body heat, the fragrance coated hair and skin. Cleanliness was essential. After bathing, scented oils were applied from stone or alabaster vessels, items as beautiful as the rituals they supported. Skincare was survival. Oils like palm, shea, and castor protected against the sun and dryness. Mixed with herbs, they healed wounds, soothed inflammation, and preserved youthful glow. Body scrubs made from sand or crushed seeds exfoliated long before sponges existed. In Nubia, hair was a story. Elaborate braids, shaved patterns, and styled coils signified tribe, age, and marital status. Henna dyed the strands. Beads, shells, and gold threads adorned them. Hair wasn't just styled, it was constructed. Regal, defining. Further west, in Yoruba and Songhai societies, body painting was central. Indigo and ochre pigments were applied for rituals and ceremonies. Tribal, marks scarified or painted weren't seen as disfigurements. They were beauty enhancements. They were maps of identity etched into the skin. But beauty always comes at a cost. Throughout history, the pursuit of perfection often blurred into pain. Lead, arsenic, mercury crushed insects' cosmetic staples. Across continents, they brightened skin, colored lips, and burned health from within. Lead face powders in Rome, Greece, and Renaissance Europe caused hair loss, organ failure, and death. But pale skin? Still the goal. In China, noble women once bound their feet in pursuit of the lotus foot, a symbol of femininity and obedience. Though the practice became more widespread later, early signs of it appeared in elite circles. The result? Deformity, pain, but also status. Maya and Aztec modifications left permanent marks. Inserting jade into your teeth, reshaping your skull axe. Of honor, yes, but also tremendous physical toll. Likewise, African and Middle Eastern scarification, done without modern antiseptics, came with infection risks. But the scars were badges of strength and beauty. Even perfume had dangers. Egyptian scent cones often included cinnamon oil and irritant in large quantities. And in a world where water for bathing was scarce, layering oils trapped dirt, sometimes inviting infection. Cosmetics and treatments weren't standardized. One person's secret remedy was another's toxic exposure. Knowledge passed by whisper, tradition, or etched text open to interpretation and error. Yet across every region, one truth held. Beauty was never just skin deep. It reflected values, beliefs, and hierarchies. It connected bodies to gods, faces to identity, and rituals to resilience. Time, power, divinity, nobility, virtue. beauty throughout the ancient world was intimately tied to these ideals. But the cost? It was often paid in silence. The damage was hidden beneath powders and pigments, under veils of perfume, masked by elaborate hairstyles and poetic metaphors. Scars didn't cancel beauty. They became part of its price. Pain, in many cases, wasn't the exception. It was the expectation. Long before monopoly sparked family arguments over fake money, the people of ancient Mesopotamia had already fallen in love with board games, especially one mysterious and mesmerizing contender, the royal game of yore. Unearthed in the 1920s by British archaeologist Sir Leonard Woolley in the Royal Cemetery of Yore, the board was buried with the dead, nestled among treasures, as if it too were meant to follow the soul into the next world. This game isn't just old, it's ancient. Over 4,500 years old, making it one of the oldest known board games in existence. But the royal game of yore wasn't merely a casual distraction. It wasn't something played in a lazy moment. This was a ritual object, loaded with symbolism, possibly even designed as a tool of cosmic insight. The board was a small rectangular box composed of 20 decorated squares, fashioned with lapis lazuli, red limestone, and shell inlaid with bitumen. It looked less like a game and more like a divine relic, too beautiful to merely entertain, too precise to be random. Players used pyramid-shaped tetrahedral dice to move their 7 game pieces from one end of the board to the other. On the surface, it was a race. The objective was to get all your pieces safely off the board before your opponent. But beneath the simplicity, scholars believe, lay a spiritual map. Some researchers proposed that the layout of the board represented the journey of the soul through the uncertainties of life. The central spaces may have signified zones of danger or blessing places where fate intervened, either to assist or punish. Playing the game was not just a challenge of luck and strategy. It was a simulation of existence, an echo of divine forces acting through random throws and careful choices. And speaking of divine forces, the gods were very much involved. Clay. Tablets from later Mesopotamian periods describe how the royal game of yore was used for divination. People didn't just play, they consulted it. Dice rolls were interpreted like omens. Positions on the board were read the way someone might read, as stars or tea leaves. In this context, the game became a tool of prophecy. The future could be glimpsed, fate questioned, divine will interpreted all by watching how the pieces moved across the sacred grid. You might call it the original tarot deck with rules. And it wasn't confined to Mesopotamia. Versions of the royal game of yore have been found as far afield as Egypt and India, indicating that it traveled along trade routes and captured the imagination of multiple cultures. It may have been humanity's first truly international game, centuries before chess or checkers ever existed. To the ancient Sumerians, playing wasn't idle fun. It was a ritual encounter with the structure of the universe, a metaphorical race through chaos, risk, order, and transcendence. It was fate in 20 squares, and to win was not only triumph, but alignment with cosmic will. Meanwhile, across the deserts and temples of ancient Egypt, another board was waiting. This one didn't just simulate life, it symbolized the afterlife. Senet. It's one of the oldest documented games in history, played as early as 3100 BCE. It shows up in tomb paintings, on pottery, in literary texts, and carved into sacred artifacts. But Senet wasn't a mere pastime. It was a preparation, a rehearsal for what came after death. The Senet board consisted of 30 squares, arranged in 3 rows of 10. Each player controlled 5 or 7 pieces and attempted to move them across the board, navigating them through challenges and out the final square to victory. Victory, in this case, meant safe passage through the underworld. The moves were determined by casting throwing sticks or knuckle bones, These acted as proto-dice primitive, irregular, and divinely influenced. But success wasn't all luck. There was strategy involved. Knowing when to advance, when to block, when to take risks. These were the choices that shaped both your game and, metaphorically, your soul's journey. By the time of the New Kingdom, around 1550 BC, Senet had taken on overtly religious meaning. Certain squares were labeled with hieroglyphs. House of Rebirth, House of Waters, House of Happiness. The board now reflected the stages of spiritual purification and resurrection. It wasn't just a game, it was theology in tiles. Pharaohs like Tutankhamun were buried with their own Senet boards, not as trinkets, but as tools. In the tomb, Senet became a passport, a navigation device for the afterlife. Playing the game was symbolic practice for guiding the soul through the Duat, the Egyptian underworld past demons, trials, and divine judgment toward eternal peace. Senet evolved from a casual game to a sacred object. It was painted on the walls of tombs, laid in the laps of carved pharaohs, and etched into the daily lives of Egypt's elite. To play Senet well was to align yourself with Mat, the concept of cosmic balance, order, and truth. It wasn't about having fun. It was about becoming worthy. Together, the royal game of Ur and Senet remind us that in the ancient world, games weren't always games. They were lessons, mirrors, and bridges. They turned life's chaos into pattern. They gave people a place to encounter fate on a controlled stage. Where modern board games simulate property and power, these ancient games simulated existence itself. To cast a die was to speak with the divine. To move a token was to mark your place in the universe. And to win, it wasn't just triumph. It was transcendence. Senet had evolved into something far more than a household diversion. It became a symbolic enactment of the soul's voyage through the Duat, the Egyptian underworld. Certain squares on the board came to represent key stages of that journey: rebirth, judgment, peril, purification. Each turn of the game wasn't merely a gamble. It was an invocation of divine will. The iconography surrounding Senet became increasingly mystical. Boards were inscribed with hieroglyphs representing protective deities or spells. Square 26 often symbolized the House of Rebirth, while Square 27 might be the House of Happiness. Landing on one could grant divine protection. Others brought delay, danger, or misfortune. The board was no longer just a game. It was a microcosm of the afterlife, a spiritual obstacle course crafted in cedar and pigment. Senet was intimately linked with the goddess Mati, the embodiment of truth, justice, and cosmic order. Playing well symbolized the soul's ability to navigate the moral trials of the afterlife, where it would be weighed against the feather of Mate. Win the game, and you might win immortality. Lose, and you had better hope someone packed extra amulets in your tomb. Senet was not just entertainment. It was part game, part theology, part guidebook to the netherworld. In Egypt, you didn't just play Senet, you prayed through it. To the untrained eye, knucklebones looked like a child's pastime, a handful of oddly shaped bones tossed in the air. But in ancient Greece, it was far more than a simple game. It blended skill, chance, flirtation, and divine symbolism. In bustling marketplaces and quiet temple courtyards, knucklebones clattered across stone floors, echoing with laughter, rivalry, and reverence. The game used the small ankle bones of sheep or goats, known as astragaloi. Unlike modern dice, their irregular shape meant they didn't roll predictably. Players tossed them into the air, trying to catch them on the back of their hand or land them in specific positions for points. Rules varied, but the thrill did not. It wasn't just for children. Greek vases often depict young women, poised and graceful deep in the game. For them, it was a display of dexterity, elegance, and sometimes courtship. A perfect throw might catch the eye of a passing suitor. But there was more. Each side of the astragallos had a name and numerical value, ideal for both gaming and divination. A lucky throw could be seen as a message from Apollo or Hermes. The rare Venus throw 4 bones, landing on the same side, was a sign of divine favor. Knuckle bones were also associated with death and the afterlife. Buried with the dead, they were seen as toys, tools for divination, or guides for the soul. Over time, they evolved from bone to bronze, glass, or ivory. But the essence remained, a simple game steeped in mystery and myth. In Greece, knuckle bones were more than amusement. They were flirtation, fate, and divine connection in a single toss. If chess is war on a board, then ludus latrunculorum was Rome's declaration of battle. Often called latrunculi, or the game of little soldiers, it wasn't a way to pass time in a villa courtyard. It was an intellectual duel, a simulation of conflict requiring cunning, strategy, and foresight. Though the exact rules are lost, enough remains wooden boards, clay pieces, literary references to imagine the game. Played on an 8x8 or 9x10 grid, each player controlled an army of uniform pieces called latrones or mercenaries. The goal was to capture your opponent's pieces by surrounding them. No dice, no luck, just cold, calculated tactics. It was not a race like Senate or a divine journey like Mayhem. It was psychological warfare. Roman writers like Varro and Ovid mention it as a game for soldiers and statesmen alike. Some saw it as character training. Others relished the chance to humiliate friends, but it wasn't exclusive. Latrunculi boards have been found etched into floors and rooftops from Britain to Egypt. Soldiers played it on the frontier. Merchants played between deals. It transcended class, offering strategy and escape. Pieces ranged from simple pebbles to carved ivory tokens. Some boards featured special squares, possible fortresses or thrones. Some variants may have included a king piece. Regardless, the game prized logic over luck. Roman poets used it metaphorically. Losing a piece was like losing favor in court. Getting surrounded, a political betrayal. Even the gods were said to play. Latrunculi may be extinct, but its soul lives on in chess and checkers. It was Rome's intellectual blood sport. Before Senate reigned in Egypt, there was men in a spiral-shaped board game named after a protective serpent god. Men wasn't just recreation. It was mythology in motion. The board resembled a coiled snake, its body divided into rectangular segments, spiraling toward its head. The serpent Mehen was believed to guard Ra during his nightly underworld journey. Thus, the game symbolized a divine voyage through danger, transformation, and rebirth. Game pieces included lion-shaped tokens and spherical marbles. Players may have guided marbles through the serpent's body, possibly aided or threatened by lions. Movement likely involved casting sticks or dice, as with other ancient games. Though the rules are lost, the purpose remains clear. Maying was a reenactment of cosmic protection and passage, a sacred spiral where play mirrored the path of gods. Egyptian games, what makes them so fascinating, isn't just their complexity or symbolism, but how some vanished almost entirely. Take Mehen, for instance. It was widely played during the Old Kingdom, roughly between 2600 and 2300 BCE. Yet after that period, it all but disappeared, leaving behind only traces and mysteries. Its abrupt disappearance during the Middle Kingdom remains one of the great enigmas of ancient Egyptian culture. Maying once a staple of Old Kingdom, leisure simply vanishes from both records and archaeological finds after 2300 BCE. Why? No one truly knows. Some scholars theorize that the game's religious connotations, particularly its link to the serpent god Mehen, may have fallen out of favor due to shifting theological trends. Others suggest it was simply overshadowed by the rising prominence of Senate, which by that time had taken on a central role in funerary rites and symbolic representations of the soul's journey. Whatever the cause, Maine faded into obscurity, leaving behind only beautifully crafted serpent-shaped boards and lion-headed, playing pieces that speak of a once sacred pastime, now silenced by time. Intriguingly, similar spiral-shaped boards have been discovered outside Egypt, in Cyprus, and the Levant, hinting that the game, or at least its iconography, may have traveled along trade routes or during periods of conquest. Whether it retained its spiritual weight or was reduced to a symbolic puzzle in these foreign lands remains unclear. But its presence across distant regions only deepens the mystery surrounding it. In its essence, man wasn't just a game. It was a myth in motion, a reenactment of the sun god Ra's nightly journey through danger and transformation. Playing, it meant navigating along the coiled body of a divine serpent, each move echoing with themes of protection, peril, and rebirth. Mayhem was more than recreation. It was ritual. Long before the Vikings immortalized their tales in runestones and sagas, they played Tafel, a series of asymmetric board games that mirrored their harsh, combative world. From icy longhouses in Norway to the bustling trade ports of Ireland, Tafel games sharpened minds as much as axes. These were no gentle amusements. Tafel was strategic warfare rendered in wood and antler. The most well-known variant is Nefatov, or King's Table, played on square grids ranging from 11 by 11 to 13 by 13. The asymmetry of the game is its defining trait. One player commands a king and a small band of defenders positioned at the center. The opponent controls a larger force of attackers arrayed along the board's edges. The king's objective? Escape to one of the board's corners. The attacker's mission? Capture the king by surrounding him on all four sides. No dice, no luck, just sheer tactical brilliance. Like a Viking raid, the odds are uneven. The king's player is constantly under pressure, required to maneuver with surgical precision, anticipate threats, and seize narrow opportunities for escape. The attackers, despite their numerical advantage, must work together to box in a piece that is always a few steps ahead. Tafel boards were crafted from wood, bone, antler, or even stone. Wealthier warriors played on elaborately carved versions with pieces shaped like warriors, kings, or mythical beasts. Their portability made them ideal for long voyages, and their rules, though varied, echoed a single theme: conflict. For the Vikings, Tafel wasn't just entertainment. It was training. It honed decision-making under pressure and taught the value of sacrifice, positioning, and foresight. Christian missionaries attempting to convert Norse communities sometimes adapted the game, replacing the king piece with a bishop. But as chess made its way into Scandinavia during the medieval period, Tafel slowly faded, perceived as a relic of a pagan past. By the 12th century, it was nearly extinct, though echoes of it survive in regional variants like tablat. At its peak, however, Tafel was more than a pastime. It was a Viking battlefield, one that didn't spill blood, but demanded brains and brawn equal measure. In the grand courts of ancient India, amidst the fragrance of incense and the calls of elephants, another game unfolded, not just of pieces, but of destiny. Pachisi, known as the national game of India, wasn't merely a pastime. It was a cosmic simulation of karma, kingship, and kismet. Its origins date back to at least the 6th century CE, possibly earlier. It captivated emperors, none more famously than Akbar the Great. The game board was shaped like a giant cross, each arm representing a cardinal direction, converging on a central square, symbolizing the throne. Each player raced their four pieces along these paths, trying to bring them home before the others. But this was no mindless race. Movement was determined by tossing 6 or 7 cowrie shells, whose upturned sides dictated how many spaces a player could move. This blend of randomness and choice made each turn a mix of calculation and divine will. Capturing was central. Land on an opponent's piece, and they're sent back to the beginning. Timing, positioning, and psychological play were critical. Recklessness was punished. Patience and cunning prevailed. And Atbar didn't just play it, he lived it. At his palace in Fatifasikri, he built a life-sized Pekisi board in the courtyard, where human game pieces dressed in vibrant colors enacted the moves. It was spectacle, governance, and spiritual allegory woven into one. The symbolism ran deep. The cross-shaped board wasn't just geometric. It symbolized the interplay of dharma, duty, artha, wealth, kama, desire, and moksha, liberation. Mastery of the game required more than skill. It required philosophical balance. When the British arrived centuries later, they adapted the game into Ludo, stripping away its layers of meaning. But the original Petsisi endures as a lesson in destiny, discipline, and the intricate dance of life. Meanwhile, across the oceans, the Aztecs were throwing beans in games that mirrored the cosmos. Ptolemy, one of Mesoamerica's oldest known games, was more than entertainment. It was ritual, gambling, and divination, all rolled into one. The board was simple, a cross-shaped grid etched onto mats, stone slabs, or temple steps. It had 52 spaces, one for each year in the sacred Aztec calendar cycle. Nothing was accidental. Time, fate, and divine cycles shaped every inch. Players rolled 6 beans, marked with dots to function as dice, and moved their tokens carved bones, stones, or miniature idols around the grid. The goal: complete a full circuit before your opponent. But landing on an opponent's piece meant sending it back or worse. Some spaces carried penalties linked to bad omens or celestial misalignments, forcing players to forfeit goods or progress. Because yes, this was gambling. Stakes could include food, blankets, gold dust, jade, or even slaves. High-stakes games attracted large crowds. The tension was palpable. Ptolemy was watched over by the god Mikil-Koshitl, patron of games, dance, and excess. Playing was a spiritual transaction, a wager with fate, a test of divine favor. For the Aztecs, to gamble was to engage with the cosmos. And in every bean toss, something eternal was at stake. Its abrupt disappearance during the Middle Kingdom remains one of the great enigmas of ancient Egyptian culture. Mehen, once a staple of Old Kingdom leisure, simply vanishes from both records and archaeological finds after 2300 BCE. Why? No one truly knows. Some scholars theorize that the game's religious connotations, particularly its link to the serpent god Mehen, may have fallen out of favor due to shifting theological trends. Others suggest it was simply overshadowed by the rising prominence of Senate, which by that time had taken on a central role in funerary rites and symbolic representations of the soul's journey. Whatever the cause, Mehen faded into obscurity, leaving behind only beautifully crafted serpent-shaped boards and lion-headed, playing pieces that speak of a once sacred pastime, now silenced by time. Intriguingly, similar spiral-shaped boards have been discovered outside Egypt, in Cyprus, and the Levant, hinting that the game, or at least its iconography, may have traveled along trade routes or during periods of conquest. Whether it retained its spiritual weight or was reduced to a symbolic puzzle in these foreign lands remains unclear. But its presence across distant regions only deepens the mystery surrounding it. In its essence, Mehen wasn't just a game. It was a myth in motion, a reenactment of the sun god Ra's nightly journey through danger and transformation. Playing it meant navigating along the coiled body of a divine serpent, each move echoing with themes of protection, peril, and rebirth. Mayen was more than recreation, it was ritual. Long before the Vikings immortalized their tales and runestones and sagas, they played Tafel, a series of asymmetric board games that mirrored their harsh, combative world. From icy longhouses in Norway to the bustling trade ports of Ireland, Tafel games sharpened minds as much as axes. These were no gentle amusements. Tafel was strategic warfare rendered in wood and antler. The most well-known variant is Nefatov, or King's Table, played on square grids ranging from 11 by 11 to 13 by 13. The asymmetry of the game is its defining trait. One player commands a king and a small band of defenders positioned at the center. The opponent controls a larger force of attackers arrayed along the board's edges. The king's objective? Escape to one of the board's corners. The attacker's mission? Capture the king by surrounding him on all four sides. No dice, no luck, just sheer tactical brilliance. Like a Viking raid, the odds are uneven. The king's player is constantly under pressure, required to maneuver with surgical precision, anticipate threats, and seize narrow opportunities for escape. The attackers, despite their numerical advantage, must work together to box in a piece that is always a few steps ahead. Tafel boards were crafted from wood, bone, antler, or even stone. Wealthier warriors played on elaborately carved versions with pieces shaped like warriors, kings, or mythical beasts. Their portability made them ideal for long voyages, and their rules, though varied, echoed a single theme: conflict. For the Vikings, Tafel wasn't just entertainment. It was training. It honed decision-making under pressure and taught the value of sacrifice, positioning, and foresight. Christian missionaries attempting to convert Norse communities sometimes adapted the game, replacing the king piece with a bishop. But as chess made its way into Scandinavia during the medieval period, Tafel slowly faded, perceived as a relic of a pagan past. By the 12th century, it was nearly extinct, though echoes of it survive in regional variants, like tablet. At its peak, however, Tafel was more than a pastime. It was a Viking battlefield one that didn't spill blood, but demanded brains and brawn in equal measure. In the grand courts of ancient India, amidst the fragrance of incense and the calls of elephants, another game unfolded, not just of pieces, but of destiny. Pakisi, known as the national game of India, wasn't merely a pastime. It was a cosmic simulation of karma, kingship, and kismet. Its origins date back to at least the 6th century CE, possibly earlier. It captivated emperors, none more famously than Akbar the Great. The game board was shaped like a giant cross, each arm representing a cardinal direction, converging on a central square symbolizing the throne. Each player raced their four pieces along these paths, trying to bring them home before the others. But this was no mindless race. Movement was determined by tossing 6 or 7 cowrie shells, whose upturned sides dictated how many spaces a player could move. This blend of randomness and choice made each turn a mix of calculation and divine will. Capturing was central. Land on an opponent's piece, and they're sent back to the beginning. Timing, positioning, and psychological play were critical. Recklessness was punished. Patience and cunning prevailed. And Akbar didn't just play it, he lived it. At his palace in Fatafasikri, he built a life-sized Pakisi board in the courtyard, where human game pieces dressed in vibrant colors enacted the moves. It was spectacle, governance, and spiritual allegory woven into one. The symbolism ran deep. The cross-shaped board wasn't just geometric. It symbolized the interplay of dharma, duty, artha, wealth, karma, desire, and moksha, liberation. Mastery of the game required more than skill. It required philosophical balance. When the British arrived centuries later, they adapted the game into Ludo, stripping away its layers of meaning. But the original pasisi endures as a lesson in destiny, discipline, and the intricate dance of life. Meanwhile, across the oceans, the Aztecs were throwing beans in games that mirrored the cosmos. Patoli, one of Mesoamerica's oldest known games, was more than entertainment. It was ritual, gambling, and divination all rolled into one. The board was simple, a cross-shaped grid etched onto mats, stone slabs, or temple steps. It had 52 spaces, one for each year in the sacred Aztec calendar cycle. Nothing was accidental. Time, fate, and divine cycles shaped every inch. Players rolled 6 beans, marked with dots to function as dice, and moved their tokens carved bones, stones, or miniature idols around the grid. The goal: complete a full circuit before your opponent. But landing on an opponent's piece meant sending it back or worse. Some spaces carried penalties, linked to bad omens or celestial misalignments, forcing players to forfeit goods or progress. Because yes, this was gambling. Stakes could include food, blankets, gold dust, jade, or even slaves. High-stakes games attracted large crowds. The tension was palpable. Patoli was watched over by the god Mekil-Coshitl, patron of games, dance, and excess. Playing was a spiritual transaction, a wager with fate, a test of divine favor. For the Aztecs, to gamble was to engage with the cosmos. And in every bean toss, something eternal was at stake. Cheering crowds and tense spectators surrounded. These sacred matches, while priests oversaw the gameplay to ensure fairness and spiritual propriety. Before major games, players made offerings to Mekil-Coshitl, petitions for luck or forgiveness in case of defeat. To play Patoli was to stake not only your worldly possessions, but your alignment with divine forces. The Spanish, upon arriving in the Americas, viewed the game with horror. To them, Patoli was a portal to vice, paganism, and superstition. They outlawed it, destroyed boards, and sought to erase its presence from Aztec life. Yet the game lingered in memory, passed on, in whispers, or transformed into less spiritually charged variants. What made Patoli exceptional wasn't just its mechanics, it was its fusion of strategy, chance, and cosmology. The board was a microcosm of the universe. Each bean toss was a roll of fate. Each turn a reenactment of the eternal struggle between chaos and order. Today, most games are seen as ways to relax, compete, or kill time. But in the ancient world, they were anything but trivial. Games were sacred. They mirrored the heavens, taught leadership, modeled morality, and rehearsed the journey through life, death, and beyond. Take Senet and Patoli. These weren't board games. They were tools for spiritual insight. Senet boards in Egyptian tombs weren't included for amusement. They guided the soul through the do-it, testing its readiness for the afterlife. Winning meant spiritual fitness. Losing could mean peril in the next world. Similarly, Patoli was played under the eyes of Mekil-Coshitl, its outcomes read as omens. Losing wealth wasn't misfortune, it was a cosmic message. Winning meant brief harmony with the universe. Even abstract games like Mehen and Achisi were drenched in meaning. Mehen reenacted Ra's dangerous journey through night, while Pashisi symbolized the crossroads of life's great duties: Dharma, Artha, Kama, Moksha. Strategic games like Tafel and Ludus Latrunculorum taught more than tactics. They were simulations of battle, training the mind to think like a ruler. They honed the skills needed for leadership, negotiation, and war. Whether carved in stone, painted on temple walls, or played in palace courtyards, ancient games connected humans to the divine, to fate, and to one another. To play was not to escape life, but to live it more deeply, one move at a time. Spectators cheered or jeered from the sidelines, and priests were sometimes present to oversee games, not just to ensure fairness, but to maintain spiritual propriety. Before major matches, players made offerings to Mechlkoshitl, the god of games, music, and excess, hoping to secure good fortune or seek forgiveness for potential loss. Playing Ptolemy was never just a gamble, it was a spiritual risk. Winnings and losses weren't merely material. They reflected one's standing in the eyes of the divine. The Spanish, upon arriving in the Aztec world, were horrified. They saw Ptolemy as a corrupting force, a gateway device, and a symbol of paganism. Gambling was swiftly outlawed. Boards were destroyed. Still, the game did not vanish entirely. It lingered in memory, passed down in secret, or adapted into less controversial variants. What made Ptolemy unique was not just its mechanics, but its metaphysics. The board was a microcosm of the universe. Each bean toss was a spin of fate. Each move a decision in a cosmic drama. It was a dance between order and chaos, prosperity and loss. To play Ptolemy was to play with destiny. Today, games are usually seen as diversions, ways to unwind, compete, or kill time. But in the ancient world, they were much more. Games were sacred mirrors of the cosmos. They trained leaders, healed grief, told fortunes, and reenacted myth. They were serious play. Take Senet and Ptolemy, for example. These weren't casual pastimes. They were infused with religious and philosophical meaning, often played in temples, tombs, or ritual settings. Senet boards were found in the tombs of Egyptian pharaohs, not as amusements, but as guides for the soul through the Duat, the Egyptian underworld. Winning was not a matter of clever moves, but of proving spiritual readiness for rebirth. Similarly, the Aztecs believed that Mechlkoshitl watched every move on a Ptolemy board. Offerings were made, and outcomes were interpreted as signs from the gods. Losing could mean divine displeasure. Winning could signify alignment with cosmic forces. Each roll of the beans was a prayer answered or denied. Even games like Mehen and Pachisi carried weight far beyond the board. Maine reenacted the nightly voyage of Ra through the coils of the protective serpent deity, each move a metaphor for danger, transformation, and safe passage. Pachisi's cross-shaped board mapped out the four aims of human life in Hindu philosophy: Dharma, Artha, Kama, and Moksha. Playing it was a lesson in spiritual balance and existential navigation, and for rulers, generals, and young nobles, strategy. Games like Ludus Latrunculorum and Tafel were essential tools for cultivating leadership. They weren't distractions, they were tactical simulations. These games taught foresight, sacrifice, and the ability to remain calm under pressure. They were miniature war rooms disguised as entertainment. Ancient games were multivalent. They amused, educated, judged, and prepared. They connected humans to the divine, linked communities through shared rituals, and echoed the eternal questions of fate and free will. When ancient people sat down to play, they weren't escaping life. They were enacting it, understanding it, and sometimes even shaping it. Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin entered the world on August 30th, 1797, already burdened with expectation. Her parents were revolutionaries, Mary Wollstonecraft, the pioneering feminist author of A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, and William Godwin, a radical political philosopher who rejected monarchy, organized religion, and traditional marriage. Their union shook Enlightenment England. And then, 11 days after Mary's birth, her mother died. Raised by her father in a house that pulsed with intellectual ferment, Mary grew up surrounded by books, arguments, and ghosts, most notably the ghost of the mother she never knew, but read obsessively. Godwin did not shelter her from her mother's works. He encouraged Mary to read them, and she did, devouring Greek myths, philosophy, history, and early scientific theories. Her home life, however, was less than idyllic. Godwin remarried, and Mary's relationship with her stepmother, Mary, Jane Clairmont, was frosty at best. Clairmont favored her own children and saw Mary as moody, precocious, and unduly imaginative. Mary, for her part, rebelled against domestic expectations, finding solace in solitude and the written word. By age 10, she was writing stories. By 14, she was reading works that would terrify most adults. She was a tempest forming in the quiet corners of English society. Her early life, shaped by radical ideals, maternal absence, and emotional turbulence, was the crucible in which something extraordinary was forming. Mary Shelley was becoming not just a woman of letters, but a force that would redefine literature itself. In the summer of 1814, 16-year-old Mary Godwin did something that would scandalize London's literary elite. She ran away with the married poet Percy Bysshe Shelley. Percy was 5 years her senior, already famous and deeply controversial. He admired Mary's father, and soon he admired Mary even more. They bonded over philosophy, liberty, and a shared fascination with the supernatural. Their love blossomed literally. By her mother's grave in the cemetery of St. Pancras Church. With Mary's stepsister Claire Clairmont in tow, the couple fled to France with little money and no plan. Percy left behind his pregnant wife Harriet, a decision that cast a long, dark shadow. The trio wandered through revolutionary landscapes, scribbling poems by day and sleeping in flea-ridden inns by night. They returned to England broke, disgraced, and hunted by creditors. Mary's father, once a prophet of free love, now refused to speak to her. Yet through this chaos, Mary's intellect deepened. She read hungrily Greek myths, alchemical treatises, theories of electricity, and reanimation. Her relationship with Percy was exhilarating and exasperating. He was brilliant, but emotionally distant, wildly supportive of her writing, yet often lost in his own ideals. Mary had become an outcast, but never a victim. And in 1816, on the shores of Lake Geneva, lightning would strike. That infamous summer known as the Year Without a Summer, due to the volcanic eruption of Mount Tambora Mary. Percy, Claire, Lord Byron, and Dr. John Polidori found themselves trapped in Villa Diodati, their Swiss villa cloaked in clouds and rain. To pass the time, they read ghost stories, debated science, and discussed poetry. One night, Byron proposed a challenge. Each person should write a supernatural tale. Mary, then just 18, struggled at first. But after a conversation about galvanism, the use of electricity to reanimate dead tissue, something sparked. That night, she dreamed of a scientist and the monster he had created. In her words, I saw the pale student of unhallowed arts, kneeling beside the thing he had put together. From that vision came Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus. It was not just horror. It was myth, science, grief, and philosophy woven together. Victor Frankenstein's obsession echoed societies. Hunger for scientific advancement. The creature's abandonment reflected Mary's own loneliness. Themes of isolation, creation, and guilt bled into the text, drawn from her experiences and the tumultuous men around her. Published anonymously in 1818, many assumed Percy had authored it. He wrote the preface, and after all, he was the man. But the truth emerged. The world came to know Mary Shelley, not just as a poet's wife, but as the mother of science fiction. In one stormy summer, she turned lightning, sorrow, and myth into a monster that would never die. Spectators cheered or jeered from the sidelines, and priests were sometimes present to oversee games, not just to ensure fairness, but to maintain spiritual propriety. Before major matches, players made offerings to Makil-Shishitl, the god of games, music, and excess, hoping to secure good fortune or seek forgiveness for potential loss. Playing Patoli was never just a gamble. It was a spiritual risk. Winnings and losses weren't merely material. They reflected one's standing in the eyes of the divine. The Spanish, upon arriving in the Aztec world, were horrified. They saw Ptolemy as a corrupting force, a gateway device, and a symbol of paganism. Gambling was swiftly outlawed. Boards were destroyed. Still, the game did not vanish entirely. It lingered in memory, passed down in secret, or adapted into less controversial variants. What made Ptolemy unique was not just its mechanics, but its metaphysics. The board was a microcosm of the universe. Each bean toss was a spin of fate, each move a decision in a cosmic drama. It was a dance between order and chaos, prosperity and loss. To play Ptolemy was to play with destiny. Today, games are usually seen as diversions, ways to unwind, compete, or kill time. But in the ancient world, they were much more. Games were sacred mirrors of the cosmos. They trained leaders, healed grief, told fortunes, and reenacted myth. They were serious play. Take Senet and Ptolemy, for example. These weren't casual pastimes. They were infused with religious and philosophical meaning, often played in temples, tombs, or ritual settings. Senet boards were found in the tombs of Egyptian pharaohs, not as amusements, but as guides for the soul through the Duat, the Egyptian underworld. Winning was not a matter of clever moves, but of proving spiritual readiness for rebirth. Similarly, the Aztecs believed that Mechelcoatl watched every move on a Ptolemy board. Offerings were made, and outcomes were interpreted as signs from the gods. Losing could mean divine displeasure. Winning could signify alignment with cosmic forces. Each roll of the beans was a prayer, answered or denied. Even games like Mehen and Pekasisi carried weight far beyond the board. Mehen reenacted the nightly voyage of Ra through the coils of the protective serpent deity, each move a metaphor for danger, transformation, and safe passage. Pachisi's cross-shaped board mapped out the four aims of human life in Hindu philosophy: Dharma, Artha, Kama, and Moksha. Playing it was a lesson in spiritual balance and existential navigation. And for rulers, generals, and young nobles, strategy games like Ludus Latrunculum and Tafel were essential tools for cultivating leadership. They weren't distractions, they were tactical simulations. These games taught foresight, sacrifice, and the ability to remain calm under pressure. They were miniature war rooms disguised as entertainment. Ancient games were multivalent. They amused, educated, judged, and prepared. They connected humans to the divine, linked communities through shared rituals, and echoed the eternal questions of fate and free will. When ancient people sat down to play, they weren't escaping life. They were enacting it, understanding it, and sometimes even shaping it. Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin entered the world on August 30th, 1797, already burdened with expectation. Her parents were revolutionaries: Mary Wollstonecraft, the pioneering feminist author of Vindication of the Rights of Woman, and William Godwin, a radical political philosopher who rejected monarchy, organized religion, and traditional marriage. Their union shook Enlightenment England. And then, 11 days after Mary's birth, her mother died. Raised by her father in a house that pulsed with intellectual ferment, Mary grew up surrounded by books, arguments, and ghosts, most notably the ghost of the mother she never knew, but read obsessively. Godwin did not shelter her from her mother's works. He encouraged Mary to read them, and she did, devouring Greek myths, philosophy, history, and early scientific theories. Her home life, however, was less than idyllic. Godwin remarried, and Mary's relationship with her stepmother, Mary, Jane Clairmont, was frosty at best. Clairmont favored her own children and saw Mary as moody, precocious, and unduly imaginative. Mary, for her part, rebelled against domestic expectations, finding solace in solitude and the written word. By age 10, she was writing stories. By 14, she was reading works that would terrify most adults. She was a tempest forming in the quiet corners of English society. Her early life, shaped by radical ideals, maternal absence, and emotional turbulence, was the crucible in which something extraordinary was forming. Mary Shelley was becoming not just a woman of letters, but a force that would redefine literature itself. In the summer of 1814, 16-year-old Mary Godwin did something that would scandalize London's literary elite. She ran away with the married poet Percy Bysshe Shelley. Percy was 5 years her senior, already famous and deeply controversial. He admired Mary's father, and soon he admired Mary even more. They bonded over philosophy, liberty, and a shared fascination with the supernatural. Their love blossomed literally. By her mother's grave in the cemetery of St. Pancras Church. With Mary's stepsister Claire Claremont in tow, the couple fled to France with little money and no plan. Percy left behind his pregnant wife Harriet, a decision that cast a long, dark shadow. The trio wandered through revolutionary landscapes, scribbling poems by day and sleeping in flea-ridden inns by night. They returned to England broke, disgraced, and hunted by creditors. Mary's father, once a prophet of free love, now refused to speak to her. Yet through this chaos, Mary's intellect deepened. She read hungrily Greek myths, alchemical treatises, theories of electricity and reanimation. Her relationship with Percy was exhilarating and exasperating. He was brilliant but emotionally distant, wildly supportive of her writing, yet often lost in his own ideals. Mary had become an outcast, but never a victim. And in 1816, on the shores of Lake Geneva, lightning would strike. That infamous summer known as the Year Without a Summer, due to the volcanic eruption of Mount Tambora Mary. Percy, Claire, Lord Byron, and Dr. John Polidori found themselves trapped in Villa Diodati, their Swiss villa cloaked in clouds and rain. To pass the time, they read ghost stories, debated science, and discussed poetry. One night, Byron proposed a challenge. Each person should write a supernatural tale. Mary, then just 18, struggled at first. But after a conversation about galvanism, the use of electricity to reanimate dead tissue, something sparked. That night, she dreamed of a scientist and the monster he had created. In her words, I saw the pale student of unhallowed arts, kneeling beside the thing he had put together. From that vision came Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus. It was not just horror. It was myth, science, grief, and philosophy woven together. Victor Frankenstein's obsession echoed societies. Hunger for scientific advancement. The creature's abandonment reflected Mary's own loneliness. Themes of isolation, creation, and guilt bled into the text, drawn from her experiences and the tumultuous men around her. Published anonymously in 1818, many assumed Percy had authored it. He wrote the preface, and after all, he was the man. But the truth emerged. The world came to know Mary Shelley not just as a poet's wife, but as the mother of science fiction. In one stormy summer, she turned lightning, sorrow, and myth into a monster that would never die. She isolated herself, her mind darkened by nightmares, and her health began to deteriorate. Yet amidst the sorrow, a glimmer of life emerged. In 1819, she gave birth to her only surviving child, Percy Florence Shelley. He would become her anchor in the years to come, but even he could not shield her from the next blow. In 1822, tragedy struck again, brutally and suddenly. Percy Shelley drowned in a storm while sailing off the coast of Italy. His body washed ashore, unrecognizable except for a volume of Keats's poetry in his pocket. Mary was just 24 years old, widowed, broke, and emotionally shattered. She had lived through the deaths of 3 children, her half-sister Fanny's suicide, the suicide of Percy's estranged wife Harriet, and now the drowning of the love of her life. It was a Gothic horror no fiction could rival. Yet somehow, she endured. Mary gathered Percy's remains, both literal and literary. She preserved his poems, his reputation, and allegedly kept a piece of his calcified heart wrapped in silk, stored in her writing desk. Grief was no longer just a companion, it was her constant muse. And through it all, she kept writing. Her pen became her lifeline. She composed Valperga, a historical novel, and The Last Man, a post-apocalyptic vision of plague and isolation that eerily mirrored her own desolation. She edited and published Percy's works, ensuring his legacy wouldn't drown with him. Mary Shelley didn't just survive tragedy, she absorbed it, transformed it, and turned it into art. Love had defined her early years, but now loss would shape her myth. By the mid-1820s, Mary Shelley was alone in a way few young women of her era could imagine. At just 28, she had already buried most of the people she had loved. Her parents, her children, her half-sister, her husband. What remained was her pen, her son Percy Florence, and the crushing weight of legacy. She was no longer the radical teenager who fled England for love. She was now a widow, a single mother, and a woman surrounded by ghosts. And yet, she endured. Financially unstable, Mary relied on her writing to survive. But Victorian society wasn't kind to women who had lived too much. She was judged not only as a female author, but as the scandalous wife of a controversial poet. Publishers wanted her to be palatable, respectable. So she learned to navigate the literary world with care, balancing her radical past with the need to provide a stable life for her son. She wrote tirelessly novels like Perkin Warbeck, Ladore, and Faulkner, each weaving themes of political exile, lost mothers, and moral conflict. They weren't as revolutionary as Frankenstein, but they reflected her evolving perspective, less idealistic, more grounded, and deeply introspective. She also produced biographies, travel journals, and countless editorial projects, including the monumental task of preserving and promoting Percy Shelley's poetry. She shaped his legacy with the same diligence she once used to shape her stories. But Mary wasn't simply a caretaker of memories. She remained intellectually sharp, politically engaged, and fiercely protective of her privacy. She rejected multiple marriage proposals. She refused to publish gossip or expose secrets. She maintained friendships with writers, philosophers, and publishers, but trusted very few. Her greatest devotion was to her son, Percy Florence. She ensured he received the best education, protected him from scandal, and gave him the quiet life she herself had been denied. In doing so, she created a version of stability that had eluded her for decades. Mary's later life was marked by physical illness, recurring headaches, and paralysis in her right arm. But she never stopped writing, never stopped thinking, never stopped being the woman who had stared down grief and defied it with ink and paper. She was the last woman standing, not untouched by tragedy, but undefeated by it. Her life was no longer just a Gothic novel. It was an act of endurance. By the time Mary Shelley reached her 30s, she had become a quiet force in the literary world, not through loud acclaim, but through sheer persistence. She was no longer merely Percy Shelley's widow or the daughter of famous radicals. She was Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein, a novel that over time had begun to take on a strange life of its own. Frankenstein had first been dismissed by critics. Some saw it as a disturbing oddity. Others assumed it had been written by her husband, but the public couldn't look away. By the 1830s, the story had already begun evolving beyond the page. Theater adaptations sprang up across Europe, including the popular Presumption, or The Fate of Frankenstein, which portrayed the creature as a mute brute far from Mary's eloquent, tragic original. Still, it proved the novel's cultural power. Her monster was no longer just hers. It belonged to the world. And with that came something extraordinary. A new genre was beginning to form. Frankenstein had unknowingly birthed science fiction. Long before Jules Verne and H.G. Wells, Mary Shelley had asked the terrifying question, what happens when man plays God? She had fused Gothic horror with Enlightenment-era science, threading human tragedy through speculative imagination. It wasn't just a horror story, it was a warning. Mary herself didn't claim to have invented a genre. In fact, she rarely called attention to herself at all. But scholars now regard her as the mother of science fiction, a title she earned not through intention, but innovation. She had taken the anxieties of her era about science, morality, motherhood, and death, and molded them into a timeless parable. As she edited Percy's works and navigated the male-dominated publishing world, Mary quietly influenced generations of thinkers. Her writings explored not only politics and feminism, but ecological disaster, existential dread, and ethical boundaries. Her 1826 novel, The Last Man, imagined a world ravaged by plague and loneliness, a vision that would only be fully appreciated a century later. Though ill for much of her later life, she never stopped engaging with the world through her writing. Her legacy was already in motion, creeping out of the lab, across the stage, through the press, and into the bloodstream of modern culture. Mary Shelley had breathed life into an idea that would never die, and for that, literature would never be the same. They allowed her to raise her son, but not to speak too freely. Mary played a long and careful game. She towed the line between respectability and rebellion, crafting a public persona that was quiet, literary, and maternal, while still protecting her radical lineage beneath the surface. When editing Percy's poetry and writing his memoirs, she subtly sanitized his atheism and revolutionary views, ensuring that his works could reach a wider, more conservative Victorian audience. Critics have debated this move for decades. Was it betrayal or strategy? Perhaps it was both. Mary understood the politics of reputation better than most. But while she worked to preserve Percy's legacy, she also fought for her own. Publishers wanted her to be silent, anonymous, or at best, the footnote to her husband's genius. Mary refused. She continued writing novels under her own name. In an era when women were still publishing under male pseudonyms, Mary Shelley insisted on visibility. At the same time, she quietly inserted political themes into her fiction. In L'Adore and Faulkner, she explored issues of female autonomy, flawed fatherhood, and the social limitations placed on women. In The Last Man, she imagined the collapse of civilization and the futility of empire. Hardly subtle commentary. Mary Shelley's pen was not just a creative tool, it was a weapon. Through fiction, biography, and quiet editorial work, she shaped not only the memory of a generation, but the framework of modern literature. As the Victorian era bloomed around her, Mary Shelley entered her final decade with a quiet dignity, shadowed by physical decline and emotional isolation. Though she was still recognized for her intellect and literary contributions, the world that had once swirled with radicalism and romanticism was fading, and Mary was one of its last living witnesses. The vibrant circle of her youth Byron, Percy, Claire, even her father William Godwin were gone. The revolutionary fire of the early 1800s had given way to Victorian restraint. Mary found herself increasingly alone, burdened by chronic illness. She suffered from debilitating headaches, partial paralysis in her arms, and what may have been a recurring brain tumor. Yet she rarely complained. Her pain was simply folded into her routine, like ink into paper. Still, she remained committed to her son, Percy Florence Shelley, who had grown into a kind and affectionate young man. Unlike his parents, Percy Florence lived a conventional life, eventually inheriting the baronetcy denied to his father. Mary clung to his companionship, focusing her remaining energy on ensuring his success and protecting him from scandal, especially the ghosts that still followed the Shelley name. Though her days of bold creation were behind her, Mary kept working. She maintained correspondence with publishers, friends, and fellow intellectuals. She continued reading widely history, science, political theory, remaining intellectually engaged even as her body betrayed her. She kept editing Percy's works, carefully curating his poetic legacy while tiptoeing around the more incendiary pieces to preserve public favor. But the shadows never fully lifted. She lived modestly, sometimes on the edge of poverty, and never remarried. Marriage to Mary had never been about security. It had been about passion and shared ideals. No one else could fill the space Percy had occupied, nor would she allow them to try. In 1851, at the age of 53, Mary Shelley died of what was likely a brain tumor. She passed quietly, surrounded by her son and his wife. After her death, they found among her belongings locks of hair from her lost children, and the rumored piece of Percy Shelley's heart wrapped in silk. Even in death, Mary Shelley remained the keeper of memory, a woman shaped by loss, elevated by genius, and driven to write through every shadow. Mary Shelley died in 1851, but her voice never went silent. In the decades that followed, her work, especially Frankenstein, grew beyond her wildest imagination. What began as a ghost story by a teenage runaway became one of the most influential novels in human history. Mary Shelley wasn't just remembered, she was resurrected again and again. At first, her fame lingered quietly. During her lifetime, she had been praised mostly for her loyalty to Percy and her editorship of his poetry. Her own fiction, though respected, was often dismissed or misunderstood. Frankenstein was still seen as a curiosity, filed under Gothic. Horror, its deeper themes ignored by a world not yet ready to question science, morality, and man's place in the universe. But time revealed her genius. By the 20th century, Mary's monster had become a cultural icon. Film adaptations, beginning in the silent era and exploding with Universal's 1931 Frankenstein, starring Boris Karloff, gave her creation a new face. Literally, the creature became a misunderstood symbol of modern anxiety, a tragic being forged by human arrogance and cast out by society. Each adaptation reflected the fears of its time: war, technology, nuclear power, artificial intelligence. And always, at the core, Mary Shelley's fingerprints. Scholars began to revisit her work with new eyes. Feminist critics championed her not just as the wife of a poet, but as a literary architect in her own right. They explored her insights into motherhood, grief, creation, and power. The Last Man, once overlooked, was reevaluated as an early dystopian masterpiece. Her life itself, marked by rebellion, intellect, and endurance, became as fascinating as her fiction. Today, Mary Shelley is not just remembered, she is revered. She is called the mother of science fiction, the queen of Gothic literature, a pioneer who fused the personal with the philosophical. Her legacy lives on in classrooms, laboratories, film studios, and political discourse. Whenever we ask what it means to be human, or what happens when creation outruns conscience, we're speaking in her language. She gave us a monster. But in doing so, she gave voice to every outsider, every orphaned idea, every mind cast out for being too curious. Mary Shelley didn't just write a novel. She rewired literature's DNA.